parts. I really, really, really like to be interrupted. It makes me happy inside when people ask questions. And I want to make sure that the way we spend this next hour is useful to you. So really, please, it is polite to interrupt me where we've all been taught it is not polite to interrupt. I would love to be interrupted. I would love to have you ask questions. Second, and it kind of as an addendum to that, because we're on two screens, if you raise your hand or somehow signal that you want to say something and I don't respond to you, use the little hand raising function or just shout out. So just say, excuse me, and I will stop. But there's also in reactions, there's a little function. If you click on reactions, there's a thing that looks like a little hand, and that will say to me, Betsy, pay attention. So I will definitely make sure to call on you. What we're going to talk about today is trauma, what it is, and where it happens in our brains, and therefore what it does to our bodies. If we have time, I want to also think about some questions about reopening and what kinds of things that's going to stir up for us, for our children, for our grandchildren. So that's my plan. If it's not your plan, then you'll lead me down a tangent and I will happily follow you on that road. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood. I'll go down your road. I'm going to start by putting a definition of trauma in the chat box. It is an imperfect definition. All definitions are by their very nature imperfect. But I want us to have a shared understanding of what trauma actually is before we talk about where it happens. So I'm going to break this down. It has 5 component parts. Trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, diminishes their sense of self, and their ability to feel the full range of emotion and experiences. So 5 components here. The first one is that trauma is a response to something real. Trauma isn't a bad mood. It isn't, I had a bad dream and I woke up and I'm angry at you. It isn't, it's not overreactive, it is reactive. And so trauma happens because something happened that impacts us. And the way in which this definition is imperfect for us in our world today is that this has not been an event. It has been a series of events. COVID is not a single, it's not a single simple event, but a whole series of losses and changes and disruptions. And on top of that, we had this little election that for some of us was distressing and demanded a lot of attention, and an insurrection and racial injustice and health injustice and all sorts of questions about privilege for many of us. So that we have not had a single event, which is what's implied in this definition. We've had a cascade of events. That is important because we haven't had much recovery time. And recovery time is actually part of the way human beings process trauma, is that it kind of like you go swimming and you're underwater until you can't breathe, but then you come up and you get a gulp of air and you can go back down. We have not been able to get much of a gulp of air for the last year. That's part 1. Part 2, trauma overwhelms our ability to cope. So one of the interesting things about human beings is that we have fallback coping skills that we all use. It may be that you eat more. It may be that you eat less. It may be that you sleep more. It may be that you sleep less. It may be that you exercise more. It may be that you pick fights with your partner. We all have coping skills that we fall back on. What happens to us when our coping skills don't work is that instead of changing them, we do them more. So that instead of saying, I have a very close friend who has been shopping all the time in this pandemic. She hits purchase, purchase, purchase. And she says, I have a moment when I hit purchase that I feel better. and then it goes away almost immediately, and then the stuff comes to my house, and I have to deal with it. That buying things is a way that she has historically made herself feel better. It's not working, but it's not slowing it down at all. So we are seeing that in a couple of places that are notable. In the first month of COVID, I haven't seen data on this since then, but in the first month of COVID, there was a 40% increase in alcohol sales in the United States. It is not a 40% increase in drinking, because lots of people drink in restaurants and bars, but that is huge. Even if it's 20%, it's huge. We've seen a significant increase in spousal and domestic abuse. We've seen a significant increase in the use of both legal and illegal drugs. All of these are coping skills that may or may not be working. And one of the ways I want you to think about coping skills in that they fail us, the analogy that makes the most sense to me is when a 3-year-old says, I want a cookie, and you say, no, they don't say, oh, can I have a cookie in an hour? Or can I have a cookie after dinner? They just say it louder. I want a cookie. I want a cookie. And that is what we're doing. We're saying it louder, even though it's not working for us. That was number 2. Number 3, trauma causes feelings of helplessness. Most of us have never had an experience of being this helpless for this long. We've had moments of helplessness. Surely when somebody is being mugged or assaulted in any way, there is a sense of helplessness. There is a sense of helplessness when I see that I'm about to have a car accident and I don't know what, and I'm not thinking, but we don't live in a state of helplessness. That has actually been a lot of the experience of COVID. There's nothing I can do. Who is, Brad, do you have the ability to mute people? Or Sally, either one of you? Just because there's cough. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to keep thinking that's somebody who wants my attention, and then I'm going to say, are you okay? So we're not used to being helpless. We don't know what that experience is like most of the time, and we surely don't know what a lengthy experience of helplessness is like, compounded by a decreasing belief that anybody can tell me what's actually the truth. One of the things that has really happened for us over the last year or 4 years or both has been a changing relationship with the concept of truth, and whether or not people are trustworthy. So we have these feelings of helplessness. We don't know what to do with them. Most of us have rarely had feelings of helplessness that are this intense, and very few of us on this call have ever felt this helpless for this long. This is kind of like living in a domestic violence situation that you feel you can't leave. It's an ongoing bombardment. That's number 3. Number 4, trauma diminishes our sense of self. Well, so part of your sense of self is actually the belief that you are not helpless. But there's other ways in which trauma diminishes our sense of self. What is your sense of self? It's the things you believe about yourself, whether or not they're true. They don't actually have to be true. They have to be in your belief set. They have to be your facts about who you are. So they may be, I am creative. I have a very good friend who's a wonderful artist who said that for the first 6 weeks, she couldn't hold a pen, couldn't hold a pencil, couldn't hold a paintbrush. So that her sense of self as an artist was gone. But our sense of self is not only what we do, it's also who we are in the world. So part of Libby's sense of self is that she's a knitter. Me too. And cantors as well. These are the ways I describe myself to myself, and they're very comforting. Right after September 11th, I am a voracious reader. I couldn't read for about 10 days. couldn't read. I would pick up books and I would just stare at the words moving. And there is a sense then of being kind of divorced from myself, which is really makes us feel ungrounded. And part of the ungrounded is that divorce from myself. Part of the ungrounded is also that some of the times I see myself through your eyes and there's no you around. That because there's this disconnect from other people, this physical disconnect, I actually have to be looking in the mirror more and getting feedback less, which is actually can be pretty complicated for us. So that's the fourth part. The fifth part is the one that I think is poorly written. Trauma diminishes our ability to feel a full range of emotion and experiences. I don't think that's quite right. I think that people still feel joy. I think that people still feel sorrow. I think what we rarely feel is me, is normal, is kind of the center range of how I normally feel. Now, I think over time that has shifted because the center range of how I normally feel is what we're doing now. But it doesn't feel like me in the same way that that I used to feel like me. So in the before times, I had an image of myself and a sense of my own kind of normal emotional patterns. That's changed. That's changed. It's changed in different times. So I think at the beginning of COVID, for example, I think we were all in kind of overdrive. People were moving really fast. There was more grocery shopping and more, I got to get all my work done. And then there was a period, I think, where we were numb, where we really didn't feel much at all, but we just kept putting one foot in front of the other. I think the summer made many of us feel both less locked down because we could see other people on a back porch or something like that. But also really we had to kind of look at questions of privilege and opportunity and potentially see ourselves differently. The fall, I think for many of us was a period of just increasing anxiety, and until the election, and then we had January 6th just to top it all off. And so I think there's been a lot of emotional ups and downs, even beyond deaths and losses of jobs and distance from children and grandchildren and isolation for some of us. Isolation is really hard for people. Human beings are not designed to be by themselves for huge periods of time. We are innately social animals. Even those of us who are introverts are innately social animals. And being alone is really, really hard. We know all sorts of things about being alone and its impact on your stress system. And it's simply not good for us. Add to that, learning this whole new technology. Add to that, that our culture had actually moved away from phone calls as a way to connect with other people. And so that picking up the phone to call somebody actually felt awkward at the beginning. I think that many of us have gotten over some of that, but I think that part of what that did for us was it narrowed our range of relationships, because they're the people I can call and then there are the people I can't call. Some of the people I can't call are people I would have happily had lunch with, but I would never pick up the phone to just chat. And so there's these funny re-navigations of relationships. So I want to stop here and have you ask me questions, make comments, say, I see that in myself, I see that in other people about this definition. I just want to make sure that the definition makes sense, and that if you have comments on it, that you have space to do that. And again, because we're on two screens, if you raise your hand and I don't see you, use the hand raising thing. Susan, is that a hand? Susan Klein? No, that's not a hand. Any comments, thoughts? You see this in yourself.
I think when you were speaking about being isolated, isolation for extroverts was excruciating, but I think having a loss and having to sit Shiva by yourself and not have a connection, I think that was the hardest part yet of all of this.
So that is hard. First of all, I'm really sorry that you've been through this, that you've had a loss, and then you had to do this on your own. There's a compounding loss there, which is that the rituals are comforting, even if they wouldn't naturally be comforting. They're just doing what you're supposed to do feels good, and so even if you're a person for whom Shiva wouldn't have worked in the before times, the absence of the ritual or the altering of the ritual actually makes you feel even more ungrounded and disconnected from yourself. Zoom funerals, Zoom Shivas, they're better than nothing, but they're closer to nothing than they should be.
Yes.
And we are all we're all dealing with grief on grief on grief. The rituals of grief are kind of absent for us, and that makes it really hard. Thank you for sharing that, Beth Ann. Anybody else? Go ahead, Barbara. You two win the bravery awards, but Barbara, you're muted.
Mute. Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm just looking at the definition in your description. I feel that that your definition, that there are parts of it, it's almost like a continuum, because I don't think that we all, particularly me, respond to each of those things. But some of those things resonate more with me. So would you consider that still trauma, or is trauma where all of those things have to occur?
Well, notice, I was about to say there's not an and in there, but there is an and in there. No, I don't think all of them have to occur. I would rather use a looser definition of trauma, given what we're in, than one that is very tight and strict. In fact, Barbara, the psychiatric definition of trauma, which I didn't use, is one that demands that there be physical harm. And I just don't think, I don't think that's necessary. It's really interesting. Post-traumatic stress disorder, defined by the American Psychiatric Association, does not require physical harm, but trauma requires physical harm. It's not quite consistent. I think that the length of this, look, I don't think I would have been using this definition if we'd been in lockdown for a month. And I think if we'd been in lockdown for a month, we wouldn't have learned anything from this experience. It would have been a funny little blip. Oh, do you remember that month that we didn't get to go out? But I actually think that it has changed us because of the length of it and the intensity of it. And I would argue, I'm not basing this on other people's work. I would argue that trauma either freezes us in our tracks ultimately or helps us grow. And post-traumatic stress disorder is I am stuck here. And then there is another whole area of psychological and psychiatric research that's called post-traumatic growth, where I actually see myself as being different. The thing that trauma always does is produce changes in our everyday functioning. That on a daily basis, I could probably identify things about me that are different because of this experience. Whether it's sleep disruption, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, or for many of us, an increase in divorce. There has been an increase in divorce, which is not surprising. For some of us, a real increase in closeness. There's a wonderful, I'm not the world's biggest Brene Brown fan, but she did a podcast with John and Julie Gottman, who did research on healthy marriages that is absolutely worth listening to, just because they're brilliant. So there have been all those changes in our functioning actually can be manifestations of trauma. They also can be manifestations of a decision to make change. So it's not always that way. Go ahead, Susan.
Could you give us the name of who you just recommended?
I will. Actually, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to ask Brad, when he's done eating his yogurt, to look up Brene Brown and John Gottman, Gottman, and you'll come up with the podcast. And if you wouldn't mind just dropping it in the link, that'd be great. Go ahead, Eva. You're muted. No, you're not muted.
Hello. So I think that overlaying that whole definition, at least for me, is also a sense of, I say every day, I'm grateful that we have a house to live in and we have food on the table and we're healthy and our kids are healthy, and a sense of almost guilt over that gratefulness, because you look at, and also guilt over being upset about the isolation, because it doesn't feel like such a huge, a huge sacrifice to stay in my comfortable house and sit on my couch and read a book, where there are so many people who are struggling so intensely. So I think, you know, even saying, oh, I'm having trauma makes me feel like, what the hell? You're not having trauma. You're in your nice house.
So I want to give you a term to use for this, because I think we all engage in this all the time, which is competitive misery. That in fact, we tend to not feel that if I'm unhappy about something, I don't have the right to be as unhappy as I am because other people are worse off. And that is absolutely true. Other people are worse off. But feeling shame on top of trauma doesn't make the trauma go away. And in fact, when we do this to ourselves, it literally compounds it. I think the best thing that any of us can do when we feel like I've got it good is to try to make sure that other people get it good too. And so if every time you say that to yourself, you make an $18 donation to something, then that shame is productive. And I actually think that's a way to do something which makes a difference in the world with that sense of gratitude and luck. So I'm going to suggest to you that literally every time you say that to yourself, you figure out who needs $18 or $36 or $180 and give it away, because you're right. But we're not in competitive misery. I mean, if we both have the flu and I have 102 and you have 101, you still feel really badly. And so we don't have to compete for that. I think that's actually something we're all trained to do as a way to make ourselves feel ashamed of how badly we feel. We have the right to feel badly. We're not homeless and we're not out in a snowstorm, but our lives are disrupted. They're not as bad as other people's, but they are disrupted. Brad, thank you very much. I think that, I think Brene Brown is too chatty, but aside from that, I think this is a wonderful podcast. Any other questions about this definition before I move on to our brains? Okay. Libby. So one of the interesting things, it's a great question, Libby. One of the interesting things about trauma is that it never goes away, just like grief never goes away. It goes underground. One of the things we know is that new traumas pull up old traumas. So at the beginning of COVID, I was having repetitive dreams about an old trauma, which is actually one of the great indicators that you're in a trauma, when you're dreaming about old traumas or thinking about old traumas. It actually means that your brain is picking up that old stuff. So the answer to your question is depends on how well you've done, if your toolbox worked the last time. If you have a toolbox and you say to yourself, oh yeah, there I go, then you have stuff to fall back on. But if your previous trauma is one that you did not process and did not grieve, you're much less likely to process and grieve this one. We do know that people who suffered child abuse, for example, are more inclined to get post-traumatic stress disorder because child abuse is often unprocessed. Simply because we don't know how bizarre it is until we're not having it. So that very often people who've experienced child abuse are more likely to have post-traumatic stress as opposed to post-traumatic growth. Go ahead, Ellen.
Good morning. How are you? I am an attorney who concentrates in matrimonial and family law. And I have definitely seen a trend toward greater divorce. But in addition to it being more frequent, I am seeing it in a smaller group of people, and that is people who have been married longer. So I'm getting people calling me who've been married 25, 30 years who want a divorce. And what you said about the difference between trauma and change interested me, because I'm wondering whether it's the trauma or they just been thinking about something for so long, and now that they're in such a precarious position, they've decided to do something about it. Which leads me to another question, and that is whether during these periods of severe trauma, they should actually be making these major decisions to change.
Great question. Okay, so if I don't answer all of that, you'll come back and tell me. I think a couple of things are happening. I think, first of all, we never intended to spend this much time with any other human being in our lives. Even when you say to yourself, I see it down, Alan is poking his wife. Even if, when we say, let's go on a month-long road trip, that's a month-long road trip. It's not, let's sit in our house for 10 months and look at each other. This is more intimate than any of us ever expected to be with any other human being. I actually think that the community that is suffering the most, but you're probably not hearing from them, is the families with young children, because there is literally no respite, never. And I think you're not hearing from them because they're so busy trying to put one foot in front of the other that they can't even think, do I like you anymore? It's really, I need another set of hands. I do think that there are lots of couples who did not expect, I do think there are couples, not lots of couples, who might have stayed married for the rest of their lives, but for this. And that it is both the increased exposure to this other person. Many of us, as we age, lead more parallel lives than overlapping lives. And so there's an increased exposure to this other person. And I think also that trauma makes us say, what the hell am I doing? It makes us reconsider our lives. That will not end at the magic moment when you say to yourself, I can go out without a mask on. The processing of this event, this year, this series of events, I think it's going to last us our entire lives. I don't think we're going to get over it. I think all of us, because of the length of it, will be permanently changed by this. The question is, in what way? And what was your last question? Should people make decisions during this time? What a wonderful question. And it leads me beautifully into what I want to talk about brains. So after I do this, Ellen, you'll come back and tell me the answer to that question. So I'm going to go on to brains just because I'm looking at the clock. I hope there is not a neurologist in the chat in the Zoom room, but if there is, forgive me for this grossly simplified brain geography lesson. Our brains are relatively are built so that the stuff at the back of your brain is more primitive and the stuff at the front of your brain is more sophisticated. So thinking happens here, analysis happens here, intentional behavior happens here. What happens in the very back of your brain is breathing and heart rate, and then slightly in front of that, we have parts of our brains that don't have words, but that their job is to keep us alive. So there's a part of your brain right around here behind your ear that's called your amygdala. You don't need to remember that, but I may throw the word in. And what your amygdala does is its job is to detect threats. Its job is to help you escape. Its job is to be a conduit for highly emotional memories to be stored in long-term memory. It's also actually, interestingly, it does that. It also has a lot of music in it. Music goes through this same part of your brain, which is why my children can sing the states in alphabetical order, because it got into their long-term memory through this little part of your brain. It's called the amygdala. What your amygdala is supposed to do is, in our case, what we're going to talk about is it's supposed to keep you alive by detecting threats out in the world. So your amygdala is supposed to, I see a car coming at me. My amygdala is supposed to make me react without thinking. So I have kind of three basic reactions: fight, flight, and freeze. And my amygdala chooses one, but doesn't think, doesn't have words. It doesn't say, Betsy, that's a car coming, you should move. It just acts. So it is almost reflexive, and our reflexes actually also live there. That my response to that car coming is not with words. So what's supposed to happen is that when the car comes at me, my amygdala is supposed to make me do something. And then my thinking brain, which frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, it's all the same thing. My frontal lobe is supposed to calm me down. So after the car goes by, I say to myself, Betsy, you shouldn't be walking in the snow. That's stupid. That's one way I could calm myself down. It could say to me, I hate people who drive pickup trucks. It could say to me, you knew that was a dangerous corner. You should have been looking. All sorts of things that calm down, not my frontal lobe, but my amygdala. We know that it takes generally about 30 minutes to really calm it down. But what we know is that I almost immediately go, once I know I'm alive and I'm okay, I go to my frontal lobe and I start the calming down process. So that makes sense? So what happens is this part of my brain spots danger. It does not have to be accurate. It reacts immediately. And then this part of my brain calms me down. And what happens as this part of my brain calms me, what happens when this happens is that I get flooded with stress hormones. And we can easily evaluate those. Actually, we get flooded in our mouths. That's one of the places it's easiest to test stress hormones. And after about a half an hour of you're okay, the stress hormones diminish in my mouth significantly, and I'm ready to re-engage without being on the edge. But we haven't come off the edge. We've basically been on the edge for most of 10 months. Most of 11 months, I'm sorry, and that's COVID brain. And it has impacts on us that are both psychological and physical. First of all, we get this thing that I'm calling COVID brain, which I'm sure you all have experienced at one point or another, where I can't really think as clearly as I'm used to being able to think. I taught a class at Hebrew Union College this summer that was called Trauma, Resilience, and Spirituality. I didn't have anything much to cover, but when I talked to them about COVID brain, I said to them, give me examples of COVID brain. And one student said that he got in the shower fully clothed. I thought that was hysterically funny, but I've since twice gotten in the shower with my glasses on. So it's maybe not so funny. I don't know if other people have done that, but I have gotten in the shower with my glasses on. But the best one I heard was somebody who stirred the rice with her cell phone. That's COVID brain. That's a really good example of COVID brain. Things that you know better than, so your keys are in the freezer, that's COVID brain. I walk into a room and I say to myself, what did I come here for? That's COVID brain. And COVID brain has to do with the fact that your amygdala is so stirred up that it hijacks, it literally sucks blood away from your frontal lobes. It hijacks your thinking brain. So your reactive brain is winning a lot of the time. So what do we see because of that? Well, we see a bunch of things. First of all, and let's understand as part of this that our brains are not enormously developed unless you're a major gamer from what they were 1,000 years ago. Our brains have not really dramatically changed. If you're a gamer, there actually are parts of your brain that are stronger and bigger than mine in that skill set, but our brains are not dramatically different. So think about your brain as being a 16th century brain that has kind of a lizard brain and a thinking brain. Lizard brain and a thinking brain. So the first thing that happens as a result of this part of your brain being all stirred up is that we have sleep disruption. Well, that makes tons of sense because sleeping is one of the most dangerous things you can do if there are saber-toothed tigers in the area, right? It makes no sense to sleep deeply because you actually have to be alert. This is the same reason that parents of young children don't sleep well, because you sleep with one ear open, as opposed to the way you slept when you were a teenager, which is the sleep of the dead. So what happens is what our normal sleep pattern is that we have REM sleep cycles, which get longer and longer and longer over the course of the night. And those REM sleep cycles are the lengthening sleep cycles is where the real restful sleep happens. What happens in trauma, and this happens for people who have been in wars, this happens for people who have been assaulted, it happens for anybody who's experienced some real trauma, is that we wake up repeatedly during the night, not just because we're old, but because our brains alert us and say, that's enough sleep, you better look around. And we wake up slightly agitated. Now, I think for many of us, we woke up agitated more at the beginning, and there's just the waking up, oh my God, I'm awake again. But initially, there's the waking up agitated, which means that it's harder to get back to sleep. And which means that I'm not getting, that no matter how much I'm sleeping, my sleep is not truly restorative. And so many of us turn to different kinds of medications, whether it's, Benadryl or alcohol or sleep aids. They also disrupt your REM cycles. And so you may be sleeping, but the sleep is still not the restorative sleep that our bodies actually want. That contributes to our COVID brain. So we have this major sleep disruption. The other thing that happens for many of us in sleep and in waking is that we are ready for danger. And so we sleep tense. I very often wake up and think to myself, my arms hurt. Well, that's because I must have been doing this all night long. And that's my amygdala trying to keep me alive. We know that that there has been a huge rash of broken teeth in Americans. If I'm going to ask you all to just take a minute and notice if your top teeth are touching your bottom teeth right now. If they are, put your hand up. In fact, your top teeth and your bottom teeth are not supposed to touch at rest. But the fact that they're touching is an indication that your jaw is tense. So we've seen an increase in broken teeth. We've seen an increase in people who use mouth guards, because we're grinding our teeth. Again, this is our bodies saying, be alert, there's danger out there. Somebody told me yesterday that there's also been a significant increase in broken toes, which I wonder if it's just we're not paying attention, or if there are too many toys on the floor, I don't know. But that there's also been an increase in broken toes. So that's one thing that this kind of hyperarousal does to us. Another thing that the hyperarousal does to us has to do with the fact that our brains are not much more sophisticated than they were hundreds or even 1,000 years ago. The thing that killed most people historically in danger was famine. In a pre-industrial society, famine is just extraordinarily dangerous. So what does our amygdala say to us when we're under significant duress for a long period of time? It says, eat, 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 because there might not be food. And so the kind of normal, so that also happens for us in the winter. It's the same response. Eat, 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 there might not be food. You need to bulk up to stay warm. This is not your thinking brain that's telling you to do that. This is your lizard brain. So the weight gain that many of us have had is part of your amygdala doing its job. Your brain is trying to keep you alive. The other way we saw this at the beginning for sure was in the hoarding, because hoarding is very similar to eating. That I'm going to make sure I have enough. I have enough. I have enough. And I think we all engaged in that in many ways. I am a baker. I always have jars of yeast in my house. There was one time that I was in the grocery store and I saw packets of yeast and I thought, oh, I have to buy packets. I don't like packets. I use jars. But there is this sense of limited resources that made us hoard toilet paper. It made us hoard flour. It made us buy more than we needed because somehow we were afraid we were going to starve. We also, as a result of that, and I think actually this is going to be a significant issue when kids go back to camp and when kids go back to school, that we're going to see a lot of body image issues amongst all of us, and particularly amongst teenagers, because teenagers spend a lot of time in body image issues anyway. It is one of the things I'm concerned about when we get to the after times, that we're going to be dealing with kids who are really struggling with their sense of their own bodies and what their bodies are supposed to look like and what their bodies do look like. I don't mean supposed to, that's their supposed to, it's not my supposed to. We also see some diminishment, it's not as much as in some of the other stuff, in libido. Because obviously, if you're at risk of losing your life, there's that saber-toothed tiger coming. Sex is a very bad distraction. And so that is actually a pretty common response to trauma, is a really diminished libido. So we see all of these things happening to us, and because we don't know why they're happening to us, why am I eating more? Why am I sleeping so badly? They not only create a result of stress, but then they create stress. And so when if I wake up in the middle of the night, alerted and alarmed, and I have all that stress, all those stress hormones, and then I say to myself, what is wrong with me? It just escalates, and the sleep disruption gets worse. So these are things that are normal, and we see them all the time. One of the other aspects of the sleep disruption that I forgot to say is that we remember more of our dreams, because we awaken ourselves in a more of a dream state. You are not dreaming more than you were dreaming before, but you are remembering or being aware of your dreams more than you were remembering or being aware of them before. So we are in this competition between our thinking brain and our lizard brain. And in that competition, most of the time, under duress, your lizard brain wins. It hijacks your thinking brain. So questions about this part? Comments, questions, ideas? Go ahead, Marion. Unmute, Marion. You know what? One of the things I'm really looking forward to in the after times is never saying unmute to people again.
I'm unmuted now. One of the things that has happened with this COVID isolation is I think we learned that we can deal with being alone, and we have to become more resourceful as to how we get through 24 hours a day.
Absolutely. So I think that one of the mistakes we make when we talk about this time is that we talk only about the losses and not about what I'm going to call COVID keepers, the things that I have learned that I want to hold on to. Not saying you're muted, but for example, I think that many of us have discovered that Zoom is a wonderful way to get I Zoom with my grandchildren. It's a great way to engage with people that I can't see. It is we have wonderful opportunities to learn that we would not have had in a different environment. Lots of places, are doing lots of free learning. And for many of us, that actually helps manage the day. Temple Emmanuel, the Steichler Center in New York, has lectures all day long if you're interested on all sorts of different topics. So that we're learning more. We may be reading more. I think we're figuring out who really matters to us in ways that are really important. I think we're learning things. We're learning new skills, and we're learning things about the skills we have. I actually hope that when we're done with this experience, and I don't think we'll ever be done with it psychologically, but when there's a greater sense of freedom, I hope that we figure out what we want to keep. So for example, there is a significant subset of kids who are doing much better in virtual school than they ever did in live school. Why is that? Well, I think some of them are kids for whom the social exposure was horrible. They're kids for where the noise in school is horrible. They're kids who are afraid to walk down the hall. And they are in an educational setting now where education is what matters. And if you've got a good teacher and you hate that social pressure, this is heavenly. And I really wonder whether or not we're going to have to figure out ways I hope we figure out ways to maintain this kind of experience for some of those kids. I am hearing from lots of Jewish educators that one-on-one Hebrew practice for 10 minutes a week is infinitely more effective than Hebrew practice that's as we've done it historically, an hour and a half in a class with 12 other kids. That there are things that we are really getting from this experience that I hope we figure out which of those things we want to hold on to. And those I think are COVID keepers. Okay, Ellen, did I answer any of your questions?
You started to. I'm working on the thinking brain versus the lizard brain. I'll respond to it. But something, you triggered a very interesting thought in my mind, I think. When you mentioned COVID brain and started describing it, because I see a relationship between COVID brain and dementia.
No.
Not that it's the same thing, but that it sometimes may be manifesting itself in the same way.
It may look the same, and I think a lot of people who are experiencing COVID brain are saying to themselves, is this early dementia? Is this early Alzheimer's? It isn't the same, but the manifestations may feel and look the same. And the fear is happening in your lizard brain, which of course then makes your thinking brain less effective at talking yourself off that cliff.
Right. So you jumped ahead of me, because that was going to be my question. And how do people deal with that fear? Because it's very difficult. It could be very difficult to distinguish between the two.
Right. So in many ways, COVID brain is more like chemo brain. It's the kind of spacey that if I think about it, I can attribute it to something else.
Mm-hmm.
But I think many of us are spending parts of our day at least saying, I'm slipping. I'm really slipping. Because of course we are slipping. And I think the solution to that is simply to understand why this is happening, that it is your brain trying to keep you alive.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is an indication that your brain is working, not that your brain isn't working. Chemo brain is the same thing. It is your brain trying to keep you alive, trying to keep you focused on survival issues, because your thinking brain is so distracted by the duress and the stress. Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. So my question has to do with, because I see we're wrapping up the time. Can you recommend, or do you know of organizations that specifically will be working with people who are suffering from this kind of trauma?
So I just put a name in the chat box of a man who has written a spectacular book. I think it's called The Body Knows the Score. Bessel van der Kolk. What a great name. He has YouTube videos and he has TED Talks, and he is really a guru of trauma and bodies. And that's where I would start. Because if you have enough brain to read, that's where I would start. And if you don't have enough brain to read, I would start with a TED Talk. I think there's going to be a lot of work around recovery of, as we reopen, as we begin to enter the after times. I assume you all are still in total lockdown. Is that right? Okay. As we begin to enter the after times, I think we're going to have another wave of trauma. And I think it's going to be for a couple of reasons. First of all, one of the things that's been incredibly difficult about where we are today, and it will change but still exist as we move towards the future, has been that we don't know what to do. Nobody tells us what to do. And we're being bombarded with lots of different information about what to do. Making decisions is exhausting. People are, and we actually know that if you're going to have surgery, you want to have surgery in the morning, because once your doctor has made 27 different decisions, he or she is not going to do the work as well as they did earlier in the day. That we really do have something called decision fatigue. This time, maybe partly because of the last 4 years, but absolutely because of this year, we have been tasked with making choices where we don't have enough information over and over and over again. And our culture is such right now that if you make this choice and I make that choice, we actually feel like we're not on the same team. So that many of us feel defensive about whatever decisions we've made. We're not as comfortable with the decisions we've made as we have historically been, partly because we don't know whether or not they're right. My daughter-in-law is pregnant. Should she get a shot? Should she get a vaccine? Well, some people say yes, some people say no. And there's a life hanging in the balance. There may be two lives hanging in the balance. These are huge decisions that we're not equipped to make, and yet we have to make them. That's a bigger decision than the decision of, am I in a pod or am I not in a pod? But the other piece of that is that we also have to trust other people's words. If somebody says to you, I'm being really careful, you don't actually know what that means. I may say to you, I actually had a friend say to me, I'm being really careful. let's go for a walk. And we went for a walk, and she told me she had a dinner party for 4 couples. That is not my definition of careful. What do you do then? Well, I'm not walking with her again. But I don't even have the social skills to say, what is wrong with you? You can't expose me like that. We are going to have to re-navigate the world. And we're not going to re-navigate the world as the person I was before this. We're going to re-navigate the world as the person I am now, who feels a little less sure and a little less comfortable and a little less trusting in her own decisions and in the decisions of others. So that navigation, I think, is going to, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I think it's going to be extremely difficult. There are things that I am worried about. The thing I am most worried about is about adolescence and suicide, honestly. We know that there is a surge in adolescent suicide when kids go back to school in the fall. That is actually the highest point of the year for adolescents to either attempt suicide, succeed at suicide, or think about suicide. And I'm really worried about what our kids are going to experience when we tell them to go back. Because first of all, there is no going back. I'm different. The world is different. But we know that in many ways, school, it creates enormous pressures for kids. And so I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about our ability to walk into physical spaces that have been deemed dangerous over time. I've been saying to, I said to a group of executive directors of synagogues recently, and also to a group of rabbis, that I think one of the things that we really need to do is have benches outside of everything. So that if you walk up to the shul door and say to yourself, I can't do this, I'm not ready to walk in, that there's a place to wait and breathe. Because I think we're gonna go to some of those places that have been forbidden and be really uncomfortable, physically uncomfortable. That's your brain trying to keep you alive. And I think we're gonna have to really be careful about how much we push people and how much space there is for people to move slowly. And the other thing, I have half a minute left. The other thing I think we're gonna have to figure out how to do is to integrate the story of this year into the story of our lives. The way that human beings understand things and process things is through words. And the story of this year is going to be different for me next March than it's going to be in 10 years. I think all of us are going to be telling and retelling this story for the rest of our lives, because this story is a defining story. So Beth Ann, I'm going to pick on you for a second, maybe telling this story in terms of the shiva she lost now. And in a year from now, she may be telling the story completely differently. And 5 years from now, she may be telling the story about the shiva she lost, but it will be a different story. And I think all of that we're going to have to absorb. Bessel van der Kolk has an organization. I think he's at Harvard. I'm not 100% sure, but that's where I would go. And then I would, Barbara, I would follow that thread.
Okay.
And you will find things there.
Okay.
Journaling is really wonderful for people who can journal, and some people just don't do that well. I'm going to suggest to you that one of the ways we think about journaling is that you have to do like a diary. And the upside of a diary is that we tend to do those in full sentences. We don't tend to think in full sentences, but we tend to write in full sentences. The downside is that sometimes it's too hard to do. It's too hard to get it out of me. If you I think journaling is really great. I think the other thing that is really important for us to do, and to do it without making ourselves feel guilty, like Eva was saying, is that we need to find ways to figure out what we're grateful for. One of the things that we know, and you'll see this in the John and Julie Gottman podcast if you listen to it. One of the things we know is that that gratitude makes people happier, period. It doesn't make me happy, and happy is not a reasonable state to aspire to, because none of us just stay happy. But gratitude makes me happier. If I tell you what I'm grateful for with you, I build a bridge with you. If I tell myself, if I know myself, I'm going to stare out the window all afternoon and I'm going to say, I love watching snow. If I tell myself that I'm grateful for the opportunity to watch it snow, I will actually get more pleasure out of the snow than if I don't tell myself that. And so remembering to be grateful actually makes a huge difference in our ability to feel good and to feel better about ourselves. So journaling is wonderful. I'm a big believer in gratitude. And if you have trouble remembering to do things like this, take a yellow sticky and put it on your bathroom mirror. If there's a yellow sticky on your bathroom mirror that says, what are you grateful for? You'll at least see it twice a day, and take a pause, take a breath, and tell yourself what you're grateful for. Go ahead, Beth Ann. I know I'm over. I'm very sorry.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to thank you for validating COVID brain, which I've had since 1987 when my son was born. And I called it baby brain. And then when he was a horrible teenager, I called it survival brain. And now he's married and I call it grandma brain. But I always felt it was a defect. And so I'm happy to know that like COVID brain is a real thing.
It is a real thing, and it is your body trying to keep you alive. And it's your brain trying to keep you alive. So I'm going to make one final suggestion before I disappear. I think that one of the things that we have all really lost in this experience is meaningless conversations. The conversation where I get to the grocery store and somebody pulls up in the lane behind me and I turn around and say, don't get behind me. I have such bad luck in the grocery store. If I'm in the lane, it's going to go slowly. The conversation where you're walking down the street and you just say to somebody, isn't that beautiful? All of these, the conversations when you're walking out of a class or out of shul and you make some offhanded comment to somebody else that doesn't really matter. I think that one of the things we're really missing is the opportunity to connect with people about things that aren't important. And that human beings actually need that. I'm going to suggest to you, if it's okay with Beth Ann, because she's my boss, I'm going to suggest to you that when I leave, that you take the opportunity to stick around with each other and say hi. Because you don't have to have a meaningful conversation, but we all need to feel like we are seen, hello, and that that the meaningless stuff in our lives matters. So I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to suggest to you that you stick around and say hello to people and spend some time in unimportant conversation. So thank you very much. I've had a wonderful time with you. Thank you, Beth Ann, for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
Bringing me in. And Beth Ann knows how to reach me if anybody has any further questions for me. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was
Stick around
terrific.
and enjoy each other's company.
Yes, it is.
Bye.
Terrific. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
That was really wonderful. Does anybody have any comments?
Great.
It was terrific.
Right. Gratitude area. I saw something at the Learning Collaborative about gratitude, and one of the suggestions was leave a container near your bed and a little piece of paper, and just throw in something every night or every morning of gratitude. you know, and I think it's a great idea to just, you know, if you don't want to go to the whole journal thing, it still is a real concrete way to think about how we really have to have gratitude in our lives.
But maybe that would work.
That's a wonderful idea. I love that. And Susan, I want to thank you and Wendy and the Adult Ed Committee for bringing us Dr. Stone today.
Well,
Thank you so much.
This was wonderful. I have a question. Is there a way, I know Brad said at the beginning, this was recorded. I
Yes.
can think of at least a dozen people who weren't on this call this morning, who I think would really get a lot out of this. Can we make this available on our website or somehow? I don't know what the rules are for that, but this was fantastic.
Thank you, Eva. I was going to ask the same question.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask a legal question because I think it's a great idea, but since I don't know what our arrangement was with Betsy Stone and whether or not we can do it, but if we can, I'd love to see it done. I wouldn't do it before clearing it with her though.
Right. That's what I meant. I don't know what the rules are. Ellen, you and I think the
question, but
same.
Well, we did have her permission to record.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, she